What the study says.
Okay, let's unpack this. Billions of us start our day with it, rely on it through the afternoon, maybe even reach for it in the evening.
We're talking about coffee, of course.
Exactly. And you've sent us, well, a mountain of the latest research,
Mm.
huge meta-analyses, specific studies covering everything from mortality and heart health to sleep, cancer risk, even your gut.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. So our mission today is really to sift through all that science. We want to pull like the most important insight.
Cut through the noise a bit.
Precisely. And help you understand what the current research really tells us about your daily coffee habit. Get ready. You might look at your next cup a little differently.
Feels like such a simple thing, doesn't it? Just part of the routine. But wow, when you look at the science, it's not simple at all.
It's incredibly complex. I mean, when we talk about coffee, it's not just water and caffeine, right? The research makes it clear it's the most popular drink globally, woven into cultures everywhere.
But chemically?
Chemically, it's packed. That's what the sources really highlight. Over 1,000 different chemical compounds.
1,000, okay.
Yeah.
So beyond the caffeine, what are we talking about?
Well, caffeine's obviously key, but you've got these things called polyphenols, like chlorogenic acids. They're antioxidants.
Right. Heard of those.
And then there are diterpenes, specifically caffeine and cafecyl.
Diterpenes. Okay, that sounds technical.
They are a bit.
Yeah.
Think of them as these sort of natural, oily compounds in the coffee bean itself.
And does the amount vary?
Oh, hugely. It depends on the bean, like Arabica versus Robusta. Robusta generally packs more caffeine and those chlorogenic acids.
Okay.
Arabica might have more of those diterpenes.
So the type of bean matters.
Absolutely. And how you brew it. That matters a lot, too, especially for some compounds.
How so?
Well, the research points out that filtered coffee, like your standard drip coffee machine, seems to raise cholesterol less than unfiltered methods.
Like a French press or Turkish coffee.
Exactly, those kinds of methods.
Why is that? What's the filter doing?
It seems the paper filter actually traps a good chunk of those diterpenes, the caffeine and caffeine.
Mm.
And the sources show these specific compounds, especially if you drink a lot of unfiltered coffee, like maybe more than 6 cups a day, they can nudge up your lipid levels.
You mean like total cholesterol, LDL, the bad one?
Yeah, exactly. Those things.
Wow. So the filter isn't just keeping grounds out, it's actually changing the chemical profile in a way that might affect your health. That's a key detail.
It really is. It shows how complex the whole coffee matrix is and how it interacts with us.
Okay, so starting with that complexity, let's zoom out. The big picture. People who drink coffee on the whole, does it seem to be linked to living longer, healthier lives?
This is where the evidence is surprisingly consistent. And pretty positive, actually.
Okay.
Multiple large studies, meta-analyses in the sources, they consistently show what's called an inverse association between coffee consumption and all-cause mortality.
Inverse association.
Yeah.
Meaning more coffee, lower risk of dying.
Generally, yes. Within a certain range, at least. The research keeps pointing to moderate consumption being linked to a lower risk of death compared to, say, drinking none or drinking really excessive amounts.
Is there like a sweet spot, an optimal amount?
Studies vary a tiny bit, of course, but many converge on that moderate range, often cited as somewhere between, say, 1 to 5 cups per day.
1 to 5, that's quite a range.
It is. Some analyses try to pinpoint it further, suggesting maybe around 3.5 cups a day might be linked to the lowest risk for overall mortality.
Okay, 3.5 cups. Specific, but you said within a certain range. So drinking way more than 5 cups isn't necessarily better. Might it even be worse?
Exactly. That's a really important takeaway that pops up again and again. The evidence suggests it's not a straight line. It's often described as U-shaped or J-shaped, meaning the benefit is strongest in that moderate zone, go much higher, and the benefit might flatten out or, for some health outcomes, potentially even reverse.
So thinking, I'll live forever if I just drink 2 pots a day, probably not the way it works.
That's what the curve for overall mortality suggests, yeah. The sources even tried to quantify this benefit. One analysis used dailies. Disability-adjusted life years. It's a measure of, like, lost years of healthy life due to illness or dying early.
Okay.
They estimated that a substantial number of these dailies could theoretically be prevented if everyone who currently drinks no coffee just switched to drinking 1 cup per day.
Wow. Just 1 cup.
Mm-hmm.
Putting it in terms of lost healthy years really drives it home.
It does make it concrete.
And this overall benefit, does it hold true for most people? Men, women, different ages?
In many of the big studies, yes. The link between moderate coffee and lower mortality seems pretty consistent across age, sex, even different parts of the world.
What about decaf?
That's interesting too. It often seems consistent between regular and decaf in many analyses, which, again, hints that it's not just the caffeine providing the benefit.
Good point.
There are always nuances, though. One study mentioned, for smokers, the curve was J-shaped, but for non-smokers, it looked more like a straight downward trend, a linear benefit for mortality. So lifestyle definitely plays a role, too.
Fascinating. Okay, so big picture takeaway number one, broadly positive, especially in that moderate 1 to 5 cup range. Let's drill down now. Specific body systems.
Yeah.
Starting with the heart, the cardiovascular system. That's where people often feel the jitters, right?
Right. And this area is definitely more complex. Honestly, some mixed findings depending on the specific heart condition you look at.
Okay, like blood pressure, does coffee raise it long term?
Well, you might feel that temporary spike right after drinking it, but the long-term research suggests it doesn't seem to significantly increase your risk of developing hypertension. Some studies even hint at a small beneficial effect over time.
Interesting. So the immediate feeling isn't the long-term reality for blood pressure, usually. What about heart failure?
For heart failure, the association generally looks protective. Coffee drinkers, especially moderate ones, say, in that 2 to 5 cups per day range, seem to have a reduced risk.
Reduced risk. Oops.
But here's that J-curve potentially popping up again. Some evidence suggests that very high consumption, maybe over 6 cups a day, might actually increase the risk.
So again, moderation seems key.
It really does. And interestingly, one large study found that all types of coffee decaf, instant ground, were linked to that reduced heart failure risk.
Wow, even instant. Okay, so reduced heart failure risk looks pretty solid for moderate intake, regardless of caffeine.
Yeah.
What about palpitations, arrhythmias, like atrial fibrillation, AFib? People worry about that.
Yeah, that's a common concern. But the bulk of the evidence actually indicates no significant link between drinking coffee and your risk of developing AFib.
Really? No link?
Not a strong, consistent one. In fact, a recent randomized trial, a really strong type of study, specifically looked at caffeinated coffee. They found it did not cause significantly more premature atrial contractions, those extra heartbeats, compared to avoiding caffeine altogether.
That seems to fly in the face of common wisdom, doesn't it?
It kind of does. And here's another fascinating layer from the sources. One large study looked at people who already had an arrhythmia diagnosis.
Okay.
In that group, drinking coffee was actually associated with a lower risk of mortality.
Wait, hang on. If you have an arrhythmia, drinking coffee might be linked to living longer. That's surprising.
It was definitely a standout finding in that particular study. Now, for other things like stroke or coronary heart disease, CHD, coronary artery disease, CAD blockages in the arteries, the evidence is less consistent. It's more of a mixed bag. Some meta-analyses do suggest a reduced risk of stroke.
Okay, potential benefit for stroke.
But for CHD or CAD, it's really quite inconsistent. Some observational studies, and one specific type of genetic study called Mendelian randomization.
Right, you mentioned those. They try to get at cause and effect using genetics.
Exactly. They use genes linked to coffee drinking as a kind of natural experiment, and one of those MR studies did suggest a potential increased risk of CAD.
Increased risk, okay.
But overall, those MR studies haven't really nailed down strong causal links for most of these big CVD outcomes like stroke, heart failure, or AFib. The evidence just isn't quite there yet for strong causality.
So, summing up the heart picture. Potentially good for heart failure in moderation, probably neutral for starting arrhythmias, but kind of murky or mixed for stroke and coronary artery disease, with maybe a downside at really high doses or if you drink a lot of unfiltered coffee because of that cholesterol thing.
That's a pretty good summary of what the sources suggest.
Why is it so much more complicated for the heart compared to overall mortality?
It likely boils down to those 1,000+ compounds again. They have complex, sometimes opposing effects.
Like what?
Well, potential benefits could come from antioxidants like chlorogenic acid or minerals like magnesium, which coffee contains, or maybe improved insulin sensitivity, good effects on the blood vessel lining.
Okay.
But then you have those diterpenes in unfiltered coffee potentially raising cholesterol. And caffeine itself is complex. It blocks adenosine receptors, affecting heart rate and rhythm. It affects calcium in cells.
So it could be bad at high doses.
It could potentially trigger issues at very high doses in susceptible people, yeah. But it might also help blood vessels relax, which is good. And the sources even mentioned potential differences between sexes.
Oh.
Yeah, one study hinted at an increased heart attack risk over 3 cups a day in men, but not women. And another suggested a link to less artery calcification in older women, possibly due to phytoestrogens in coffee. So it's really intricate.
Definitely intricate. Less a simple good or bad, more about the details, the condition, the amount, the brew, maybe even you. Okay, let's shift gears. An area where the research sounds much clearer. Metabolic health. Sugar, diabetes.
Ah, yes. Now here the story gets really interesting and consistently positive. For type 2 diabetes, the sources show very strong evidence for a dose-response protective effect.
Dose response, meaning
Meaning, generally speaking, the more coffee people drank, the lower their risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
wow, even at higher intakes, more than that moderate range.
For T2D risk, the data suggests the protection continues to increase with intake in a more linear fashion. And crucially, this isn't just an association.
No.
It's supported by causal evidence from those Mendelian randomization studies.
So the research strongly suggests coffee actually causes a lower risk of type 2 diabetes? That seems huge.
The evidence points very strongly that way, yes. The proposed reasons, things like improved glucose metabolism, better insulin sensitivity, your body using insulin more effectively, and maybe even increased thermogenesis.
Burning more calories.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Helping with energy balance.
What about related things like metabolic syndrome or fatty liver disease?
The evidence there is a bit less conclusive than for T2D. It does suggest potential protective effects from moderate coffee intake, but definitely needs more research to be sure.
Okay. Sticking with filtering systems in the body.
Yeah.
What about our kidneys?
Kidney
Health?
Another area with really strong, consistent evidence of benefit. Very similar picture to type 2 diabetes, actually.
Okay.
For chronic kidney disease, that gradual loss of kidney function over time, there's consistent evidence of a dose-response protective effect. Higher intake linked to lower risk.
And is that causal too?
Yes, also supported by causal evidence from the MAR studies.
Okay, so if you're looking for the clearest, most robust benefits highlighted in this research, it sounds like type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease risk reduction are top of the list.
Absolutely. The evidence presented in these sources is quite compelling for those two outcomes. And it's worth remembering again, coffee isn't just caffeine. It provides minerals like potassium, magnesium, manganese, niacin.
And magnesium could link back to the diabetes benefit
Right.
through sugar metabolism.
Yeah. Potentially, yes. That's one of the plausible contributing factors.
Let's tackle another big one. Cancer. Always complex. What's the story with coffee?
It is complex, and yeah, coffee's relationship varies a lot depending on the specific type of cancer. But the overall picture from the sources, it leans positive for several types.
Like which ones?
Coffee consumption is linked to a reduced risk for several specific cancers. Notably, skin cancer, liver cancer, prostate cancer, and endometrial cancer.
A reduced risk. That's significant.
There's also evidence it might lower the chance of recurrence for people who've had colorectal cancer.
And is there an amount linked to these benefits?
For those specific cancers, liver, prostate, skin, the benefits often seem most apparent at levels around 3 or more cups per day.
3 or more. Okay. That's encouraging for those cancers, but is it protective across the board against all cancers?
Unfortunately, no. There's one major consistent exception highlighted repeatedly in the sources.
Which is?
Coffee consumption is consistently linked to an increased risk of lung cancer.
Increased risk. That's a very important negative finding standing out there.
It absolutely is, and it needs to be stated clearly. For many other cancers, the evidence is just mixed or inconclusive. Things like esophageal cancer, ovarian cancer.
So uncertainty there.
Right. Some studies suggest a lower risk for oral and pharyngeal cancers, but it's not definitive. And when researchers use those Mendelian randomization studies to look for causality,
Yeah. What did they find for cancer?
they generally don't show a strong causal link for most cancers. But importantly, they do suggest potential causal protective effects for liver cancer, specifically hepatocellular carcinoma, and also for prostate cancer, which lines up nicely with the observational findings.
Okay, so some causal support for liver and prostate protection. Any causal risks found?
Yes, those MR studies have also suggested a potential increased causal risk for esophageal cancer and also for multiple myeloma.
Okay, so for cancer, it really is a mixed picture. Some clear potential benefits: liver, prostate, skin, endometrial. One clear major risk, lung cancer. And then a lot of uncertainty or mixed signals for others, with hints of risk for a couple more from the causal studies.
That sums it up well.
What are the proposed reasons for the protective effects? when they happen.
Again, it likely comes back to that cocktail of bioactive compounds, the caffeine, chlorogenic acids, the deuterpenes. They might act as antioxidants, reduce inflammation, maybe interfere with cancer cell growth or survival, or even influence hormone levels.
That complex chemistry again.
Oh.
Okay, let's move down the pipe, so to speak, the gastrointestinal tract, the first stop for coffee. What does the research say about gut health?
You know, despite being the first point of contact, the research on coffee's impact on common gut issues seems, well, less dramatic than for other systems.
Oh.
The sources didn't find really consistent links with things like dyspepsia, indigestion, or GERR, acid reflux, peptic ulcers, gastritis, or even stomach cancer.
So the common idea that coffee always causes heartburn or stomach upset isn't strongly backed by the broad research.
Not as a universal rule based on these sources. However, there is some interesting evidence suggesting a potential protective effect against ulcerative colitis.
That's an inflammatory bowel disease, right?
Exactly. One source mentioned research on a herbal mix, including coffee charcoal, that showed anti-inflammatory effects comparable to a standard drug in people with inactive UC.
Interesting.
And caffeine itself showed some anti-inflammatory effects in mouse models of colitis.
So maybe a role in modulating gut inflammation in some context.
Potentially. That's what some of this preliminary work suggests in terms of motility, how fast things move through.
Yeah. Does it speed things up?
Some animal studies show it can have an acute pro-motility effect, yeah. Though tolerance might develop, meaning the effect lessens over time, caffeine seems to affect how excitable certain nerve cells in the gut wall are.
What about acrylamide? That compound formed during roasting. Any gut concerns there?
Good question. The sources did mention acrylamide. It's present in roasted coffee, and animal studies have shown it can have neurotoxic effects, damaging effects on nerves within the gut's nervous system.
Okay, that sounds concerning.
It does, but interestingly, those same animal studies also observed compensatory protective responses happening at the same time. So it's another complex interaction. We definitely need more research to understand what it means for humans long term.
Okay, from the gut, let's jump up to the brain. The effect coffee is most famous for: wakefulness. How does the science explain that, and what's the impact on actual sleep?
Right, the stimulant effect. The mechanism is pretty well understood. Caffeine works mainly by blocking adenosine receptors in your brain.
Adenosine, that's the stuff that makes you tired.
Exactly. It builds up while you're awake, creating sleep pressure. Caffeine basically gets in the way, blocks those receptors so you feel less tired. It also affects motor activity.
So it literally hijacks the tired signal. Does that mean it automatically ruins your sleep?
It certainly can. The sources are clear. It causes dose-related sleep disturbances. It can reduce your total sleep time. And importantly, it messes with your sleep architecture, the different stages of sleep.
Now so.
It tends to reduce the amount of deep sleep, that restorative N3 sleep, and also REM sleep, the dreaming stage.
Does timing make a difference? Like, is an afternoon coffee way worse than a morning one?
Well, obviously, drinking it closer to bedtime makes it harder to fall asleep, but one study mentioned in the sources had an interesting finding about sleep stages.
Yeah.
It suggested that the reduction in stages like deep N3 sleep was actually pretty similar whether the caffeine was taken right before bed or even several hours earlier.
Really? So the damage to sleep quality might happen even if you drink it earlier.
That study implied the effect on the duration of those specific stages might not depend only on immediate timing, though clearly overall sleep duration and feeling rested will be more affected by evening caffeine.
And I assume how sensitive you are personally makes a huge difference.
Oh, absolutely. Huge factor. Your genetics influence how fast your body metabolizes caffeine. If you're a slow metabolizer, that caffeine sticks around longer, and you'll likely feel the sleep disruption much more significantly than a fast metabolizer.
Okay. This has been, wow, an incredibly detailed look across so many different parts of the body. If we try to pull it all together now, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the coffee science you sent us?
I think the big picture that emerges is that coffee, especially when consumed in moderation, and again, moderate, it often falls in that 1 to 5 cups a day range, depending on the specific outcome.
Yeah.
It's generally associated with some pretty significant health benefits.
Benefits like those really strong links we saw for lower risk of type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease, and the potential link to living longer overall.
Exactly. Plus those reduced risks for certain cancers, liver, prostate, skin, endometrial, and the potential benefit for heart failure risk at moderate levels.
It's definitely not a magic potion, right? There are downsides and caveats.
Absolutely. There are important ones the research highlights clearly. That consistent link to an increased risk of lung cancer is a major one. We can't ignore that.
Right.
And other areas like pregnancy or risk of fractures in women, harmful associations have popped up in some studies, although sometimes it's linked to study design or maybe specifically the caffeine component.
And we always have to remember limitations in research, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe coffee drinkers also happen to have other healthy habits.
Exactly. Confounding factors are always a possibility in observational research, even when scientists try hard to account for them. And accurately measuring how much coffee people really drink over years is tricky. Exposure misclassification, they call it.
And those details really matter, the U shape, the J shape.
They do. It reinforces that more is not always better. And how you make it filtered versus unfiltered seems to matter, especially for cholesterol. We're still figuring out the exact contributions of caffeine versus all those other compounds.
But if someone finds caffeine itself problematic, gives them jitters,
Yeah.
ruins their sleep, is decaf still a good option to get some benefits?
Based on the research we reviewed, yes, it seems so. If caffeine causes issues for you, switching to decaf appears to preserve many of those beneficial associations we talked about.
Like for type 2 diabetes
Yeah.
and overall mortality.
Yeah, the links seem similar in many studies for both caffeinated and decaffeinated, which, again, really strongly suggests that other compounds in coffee are playing a major role in its health effects.
So it's that whole complex package deal, the symphony of compounds working together.
That really seems to be the case. It's not one single thing, but the interplay of many different bioactives influencing various pathways in our bodies.
There you have it. A deep dive into the latest science on coffee and your health, all based on the research you provided. We've gone from the big picture on living longer to the clear wins for diabetes and kidney health, the nuances for heart disease and cancer, and even sleep and the gut.
Yeah, it's clear this drink we see everywhere is anything but simple in how it interacts with us. The research paints, I'd say, a largely positive picture overall for moderate coffee drinkers. Potential protection against several big age-related diseases.
But with complexities.
Definitely. The specific effects can be complicated, sometimes depending on how much you drink, how it's made, maybe even your own individual biology.
So thinking about everything we've just discussed, those U and J curves, the specific risks like lung cancer versus the strong protections for TTD and CKD, the mixed evidence elsewhere, how does knowing all this detailed science maybe change how you think about your own daily cup or cups of coffee?
We've really only skimmed the surface of this huge amount of research today, but hopefully this deep dive gives you a much clearer, more informed perspective, maybe even a new appreciation for that next coffee break.